Morning, everyone. Welcome back. Today we will talk about egoism, altruism, and social contract. And also talk about Thomas Hobbes and the reasons why he thought social contract is necessary. I was going to assign reading from Hobbes, but they actually are kind of difficult. His language is very dated, and I thought it would be more fun to read something from Nietzsche, which actually we're going to talk about on Wednesday. Nietzsche had a lot to say on the subject. I definitely recommend reading that little bit from Beyond Good and Evil. But for now, let's just talk about egoism and altruism. So first of all, egoism comes from the Greek ego, which means I. And of course, that is self-explanatory. Then it's orientation towards your own interests. Egoism means concerns for one's own interests. Now, social contract theory is, of course, kind of enlightened version of egoism. We should join together and obey a common set of rules out of enlightened self-interest. Now, a couple of interesting examples of confrontation of egoism and altruism can be found on television in particular, such as the game Survivor. Did you guys watch Survivor ever? Nobody watched Survivor? Not even single episode?
I've seen like two.
Okay. Well, I actually watched it from the very beginning. I'm old enough. I saw the first season, and then I can't say I watched every single season, but most of them, because it's very interesting. That's the idea, right? They kind of pin people against each other and force them to work together at the same time. The idea, you know the idea of the game, right? You win the $1 million, but in order to win the $1 million, you have to be, well, at this point, the way it works, one of the last 3 people, and everybody who was eliminated, well, at least after a certain point, will vote who to give the money to. So for most of the game, you have to work with these other people, because otherwise you're not going to make it to the end. They can kick you out at any point. So if you work too hard, in other words, if you're a danger to them, they'll kick you out. But on the other hand, if you don't make important moves, if you don't somehow distinguish yourself, when you make it to the final 3, you look like a potato. And everybody will say, we're not going to vote for this guy. He didn't do anything. He was coasting the entire game. So you need to find the right balance between the two. You cannot be seen as too much of a danger to others, but you also cannot be completely docile and not danger for anyone at all. So how exactly do you combine that? And there's a lot of interesting psychological stuff associated with this, which makes this game so interesting. Although there's another point I keep on thinking about, because people are really eager to go on this game, right? There's a lot of applications, and people who are there seem so enthusiastic, so happy about it, even though obviously, well, for one thing, most of them are not going to win the $1 million. Only one person wins $1 million. Although a few people win some other amounts, not nearly as much. Like they actually have payout amounts for, depending on your position. When you were eliminated, I think runner-up gets like $100,000, and then based on position, you can get as little as like $500 if you were eliminated one of the first. But of course, it's not nearly enough to compensate for the trouble. And I also keep thinking, would you guys want to be on this game? Like, I honestly, if they told me, we guarantee you $1 million at the end. Like, it's not even a game. We will give you this money. Just go there for 40 days and live the way these guys live. And I'd say, no, thank you. I mean, have you seen how much misery it is? If you didn't watch the game, you probably didn't see it. Sometimes it rains and they have nothing to cover themselves with. They're just sitting there like this in the rain going, and they eat like worms and cockroaches, and I wonder like why are they doing it? And I guess one explanation obviously is, well, they want to be on TV. That is an exposure. But I think there is also a little bit of this element, which we will come back to when we talk about Nietzsche, that if there is nothing really, no struggle in your life, no suffering in your life gets kind of boring, right? So for me, I had enough of struggle, and I don't want any more. But if somebody like their entire life, they got everything on a silver platter, and the biggest struggle for them is, to find parking spot, then maybe, yeah, it looks like it really is something you want to experience at least once. You want to live in this kind of open element and brave the, sometimes even snakes and so on. Like last season, somebody got bitten by a poisonous snake. So that really is dangerous in many ways. I remember on one of the seasons, a person kind of blacked out and fell face first into the fire and got burned. And so, yeah, it is really dangerous. Not just difficult, but dangerous. But it does present this interesting example of, indeed, how do people do that? How do they work together? And many people who come on this game thinking, I'm going to win, no problem, go home first. And then there are people who are, like there was this guy Russell, who was extremely good. He would always make it to the final 3 and never win the game. Because he was just robbing everybody so badly that even though he was making it to the final 3, they would never vote for him. And that's like another problem, right? You can be too strong. But anyway, and then there is another movie which we can mention in that regard, The Hunger Games. Did you see at least The Hunger Games? At least some of you did. So similar idea, more brutal now, because in that case it's not real life, it's a fantasy. But in this fantasy, you have to literally survive. They're killing each other, and only the person who survives in the end kind of wins the game. But in order to make it to the end again, you do sometimes need to work with these other people who in this case literally want to kill you. Because if a couple of people gang up, they can protect each other, right? And then they have better chances of surviving. So you see the point there is still, even though in the end, in both of Survivor and here, only one person gets the prize. But to get to the end, you do need to work with other people. It seems inevitable. So that's where we see this confrontation between egoism and altruism. Altruism is, of course, the opposite of egoism. It is, as Paul Kurtz said, intrinsic to the good life rather than just some life, and it means concern for the well-being of others. Broader conception of altruism, pro-social behaviors. So we all confront it, even if when we are not in games like Survivor. But in normal life, there's certainly always this balance, right? So egoism also can be ethical or descriptive. Descriptive egoism is different in the sense that this is just when you describe the fact that people are egoistic. You're not saying it's a good thing. You are saying, well, they are. So that would be descriptive or psychological egoism. People are basically self-centered or selfish and pursue their own interest. It's just a fact of life, right? You can say, I don't like it at all. I don't think it's the way things should be, but I must admit that's how it is. Ethical egoism, on the other hand, is different. This is when you say not only it is what is happening, but this is what should be happening. It is good for people to pursue their own self-interests. Altruism, on the other hand, from that position is wrong. It's just misguided. So it would be a normative theory, right? That theory is trying to suggest that this is how we should live. And this is, in fact, just as a preview, what Nietzsche seemed to be saying. We will see his arguments next time. Several other concepts to understand: empathy, compassion, and love. What is the difference between them? Well, first of all, empathy. Empathy is a psychological capacity to understand what someone else is experiencing. Right? You feel empathy if you see somebody suffering, for example, and you kind of understand what it's like, rather than some sort of detached attitude when you see people suffering and it means nothing for you. If you're a psychopath, that's how psychopaths are, right? Most of us, of course, do have empathy. When we see other people or even animals suffering, we do feel something. Compassion, on the other hand, builds on that. It includes the desire to help alleviate suffering, which is also different, right? You can feel empathy, but still have no desire to alleviate it. You can say, okay, yeah, I see them suffering, I kind of understand it, but I don't want to do anything about it. Compassion takes one step forward. It says, no, and I will actually help alleviate that. Love, on the other hand, well, it has many different meanings, but typically we're talking about something more personal. You can say, of course, I love mankind, but typically love is more personal, intimate. It has some sense of attachment to somebody. We love our family in a different way than we love humanity. We may love humanity abstractly, but the family is more personal, intimate, and so on. And that brings us to another interesting concept, nepotism. I'm sure you heard that one. What exactly is nepotism? Is favoring close relatives over non-related people. So, for example, if they're looking to hire somebody for a job, and a manager says, hey, my brother needs a job, well, just get my brother. Never mind that he is not the best for this job, he'll learn, he is good enough. Right? Why? Because my brother needs a job. I mean, like seriously. It reminds me of actually one situation many, many years ago when I was involved in a different job and doing it really well. And everybody was like, oh, okay, you're going to get full-time in no time. And then guess what? Manager's son needed a job. What can you say? I mean, at institutions like UNLV, there's actually a policy against that. They're trying to very hard to fight it. But depending on the job, especially if it's a private company, right? Well, the boss is the leader. He can do whatever he wants, or she. Right? If that's their son, well, the son gets the job. What can you do? So that would be nepotism. From evolutionary perspective, we may see there may be something indeed like even embedded into our DNA or something, because it could have some advantages, right? Why do even animals take care of their family? Like you can see cats and dogs protect their puppies. Right? They're not giving them jobs, obviously, but that's because they don't have any jobs. They can't really do that. But if they could, do you think they would? Yeah, probably. Now, debate about egoism and altruism is very important in philosophy, first of all, and of course in ethics. Ethical egoism, that's a normative value, and some people actually are saying that it is a good thing. Like I said, Nietzsche would be one of them. More recent example is Ayn Rand. I don't know if you guys remember Ron Paul. Paul Ryan. Yeah. He said that he adores Ayn Rand and she is his favorite philosopher. Well, she has this Nietzschean type of approach, which we will talk about next time. And some people say that is normal. That's how things really should be. You should be an egoist. It goes back all the way to Plato. Like if you did that reading from Republic, Plato talks about it very specifically. Thrasymachus in this first book represents more of this Nietzschean view. He's saying, if you are being just, if you're following the laws and so on, you're only helping people who are in power. And of course, for the most part, we do that because we're afraid of punishment and we can't get away with it. But remember the ring of judges? If you could become invisible and do whatever you want. Some people saying anybody would be unjust. The only reason that people are just, they are putting up a show for others. Now, reciprocal altruism. Altruistic behavior makes sense for self-interested persons when it is repaid in kind. So even people who actually are egoists recognize that. Let's go back to Survivor and Hunger Games. Under some circumstances, even though you know you're working just for yourself and you're the only one who will either win the money or win the game, it may be in your best interest to work with other people and in their best interest to work with you, because if you watch Survivor, it happens all the time. They have to make a group decision who goes home. So if you have strong connection with this group, several other people, you can single-handedly decide who goes home and you are on top of the game. On the other hand, if you don't, if you've been too much of an egoist, then that can backfire. And in fact, even little things like people get annoyed at somebody eating all the food they have and not contributing and so on, that can play a role. They can also go, why are we keeping this person who is so selfish? So being too selfish can actually undermine your interests, because we all live with other people. Social contract theory, which Hobbes represents, that's a good example of that. And then again, psychological egoism doesn't go as far. It just says, well, yeah, people are basically selfish, but at the same time, there is a difference between selfishness and self-interest. Sometimes being selfish may not be in our self-interest. Self-interest is concerned with long-term outcomes, right? But selfishness is more immediate. So acting in self-interest and motivated by self-interest could be two different things. So back to psychological egoism. Yeah, like I said, akrasia, that's actually a Greek word for it, weakness of the will. When we talk about Aristotle, we'll see Aristotle was actually mentioning that because he disagreed with Plato, with Socrates at least. Socrates was saying that if the people know is good, what is good, they will always pursue it. But Aristotle was saying, no, that is not the fact. People frequently know what is good, and they can't pursue it just because they are too weak. They don't have strength of the will to do it. Is psychological egoism true? Are people really actually selfish? That's an interesting question, because it seems like they are, but are they? Do people always act in their own interests? What do you guys think? It's sometimes hard to determine, that's the thing, because motivations are hard to pin. Remember that example I told you about my cat? Like that's a good example, because I still don't know, was I doing it for myself or for my cat? I love him dearly, but at the same time, of course, I've been a little selfish in the sense that having him around makes me feel good. So was I really concerned about his suffering so much or about my pleasure? And I can't honestly answer that. There's no one clear motivation. We are motivated by a variety of different things. It doesn't manifest itself in a very obvious way. So it has a lot to do with language, because we're trying to use linguistic concepts, but at the same time, that's not part of nature. It is invention, human invention, all those terms. And it's one of the reasons why it may be difficult. The paradox of hedonism, well, hedonism, hedone in Greek just means pleasure. So hedonism is a pursuit of pleasure. Paradox of hedonism, the impulse towards pleasure, if too dominant, defeats its own aim. And that is true. If you constantly pursue pleasure, you will have less pleasure. Isn't it funny? Kierkegaard was saying about it, actually, he called it an aesthetic stage in life, where people try to pursue pleasure. And they constantly pursue different pleasure. He called it aesthetic, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you pursue some sort of aesthetic pleasures, any kind of pleasures. But what happens if you pursue pleasures? You have they're slippery, right? You have less and less of that, no matter what you do. Like if you enjoy something, it seems like such a great thing before it happens. It may be still great thing when it happens, the moment it happens. But as soon as this moment passes, it's no longer any pleasure, and you just want to like bring this feeling back, but second time it's not the same thing. Which is, by the way, kind of also what happens with drugs. The way heroin works, it produces tremendous amount of pleasure, stimulates this certain part of the brain which produces pleasure, but already next time it works less and less and less, and then eventually there's literally no pleasure. But if you don't have heroin, you feel absolutely horrendous. So just to stay at the normal level, at the level of normal feeling, you constantly need more and more heroin. So similarly with other pleasures, it's not as distinguished, but that's the way it works. Like if you like, I don't know, bananas or something, well, if you eat one banana is great, maybe a couple of bananas, maybe 3, but imagine if you're going to be eating and eating them. Even if you don't eat all of them at once, like if you eat bananas every day, after a while it will also kind of start getting boring and you're not going to enjoy it anymore. And any other food, if you eat too much of it, no longer pleasant. If you enjoy, I don't know, travel, some people think, I cannot get tired. Trust me, if you keep on traveling all the time, you'll get tired of travel too. Because anything in large amounts gets boring. That's indeed this paradox. And ethical egoism, of course, still goes one step further and says, no, it actually is good that we are egoists. Not only we're egoists, we should be. And it can be universal or individual. So universal ethical egoism, everyone should look out for their own best interests. Self-interested by everyone makes a good community. That's kind of an essence of capitalism, right? The idea that people work in their own best interest, but we're all better off together as a result. And then there's individual ethical egoism, which just says, I ought to only look out for my own best interest, concerned with myself. And note that this is, of course, different, because then you are kind of not really caring about other people at all. You may be an egoist in the first sense, universal sense, and still care about other people in the sense that, well, can you be truly happy if everybody around you is unhappy? Even if you are complete egoists. But imagine the world when you are the only one having everything and everybody else is suffering. Would you be happy? Probably not, because, well, for one thing, seeing all these people suffering, I don't know, you have to be some sort of a psychopath to enjoy that, right? For most of us, even if you don't really care, that's just not pleasant anyway. Another thing is, obviously, other people also will not be as docile about it, so they can do bad things to you. It's pretty hard to imagine the society where everybody's suffering and they just somehow don't care that you are the only one who has everything. People usually do try to subvert it somehow. That's why revolutions happen, rebellions happen, and so on. Okay, is it a good theory? Is ethical egoism a good theory? Now, first of all, in terms of grounding, there is one argument to be made that it is natural, right? This is what some of the sophists were arguing, but that would be naturalistic fallacy. I don't know if you remember it from the beginning of class. Naturalistic fallacy tells us, well, since it's natural, it must be good. But if something is natural, as in like the way nature intended it, does it necessarily mean it is good? No. Clearly it's a fallacy. In some cases it may be, in some cases maybe not. The example book presents there is like there are some animals who have incest, and it is kind of a natural way they do it, but does it make it a good thing to do? No, it seems like there is definitely, apart from moral factor, it's just physically not a good thing, because the offsprings of incestual relations can be deformed and so on. So that just doesn't doesn't work very well. And in terms of consistency, is that a consistent theory? Universal ethical egoism. Is it consistent? Is it coherent? So can you really say that, yes, everyone is being egoistic, an egoistic society such as capitalism would be the ideal society? The society where everyone really looks for their own interest. Can you only think of your own interest and still everybody somehow live well together? Surely there is some tension here. Just like again with the games like Survivor. You have to give in order to get. You cannot constantly think of your own interest. Maybe in the end of the day you are the one who wants to win the game, but at least in immediate terms you cannot not just pretend. But that's another thing. If you're pretending that you're caring about other people, it somehow always surfaces, right? Other people notice it. You have to be really, really good actor, and even in that case, I think there would be something which will give you up. So you do have to genuinely care about other people, especially since the real life, is real life just like Survivor? Is it only one person who wins the $1 million? No. I mean, in real life, that's not how it works at all. In real life, of course, it's possible that the entire group of people will be better off. And it's not just one person gets $1 million and everybody else nothing. So that is the way they simulated it in the game in order to make it more fun to watch, but it really is not like a real society. So there's definitely some inconsistency. Prisoner's dilemma, that comes from economics, and it is an interesting ideas. Nash, in mathematics, was the first one to develop this type of relations. So let's take a look at it. This is how the traditional setup works. Let's say there are two people being caught doing something criminal, right? If they do not talk to the police at all, if both of them refuse to cooperate, each goes free. So let's say they both committed the murder together. That actually happens a lot, right? But what does usually happen when police doesn't have enough evidence already, and they still want to convict people, and there are two people accused of murder? They can offer a deal, right? They choose one of them and they offer a deal. So if X betrays Y, then X goes free and Y gets 20 years. If X betrays Y, but Y does not betray X. If X does not betray Y, but Y betrays X, then Y goes free and X gets 20 years. But if they betray each other, each gets 10 years. So looking at this setup, what is the best outcome for them?
Don't betray. Don't betray.
Don't betray. Neither betrays. But what is the problem in real life?
They assume the other person will betray them.
Well, they may not even assume it, but they're afraid of it, right? There is a possibility, and then you'd go down for 20 years. And that other person will be actually the one walking free. So, well, the way it actually usually works in court, they don't tell you to walk free. They just give a better deal, right? And it happens all the time. They can say, okay, we think you are not the main perpetrator of this crime. Tell us everything you know about this other person, and you get like 5 years or something. But if you're silent, you're going to go down the full blast for 20 years, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. Now, if that doesn't work with one person, they can go then to the other person and make the same thing. And the problem is neither one knows how much can you trust this other person. If you really can trust them and both say no, then of course it may be difficult for them to prosecute. Indeed, both people will go free. But if you have any doubt whatsoever about the other person, then you are better off betraying them right away, because that way you will get a better deal. And if you have a deal, then you certainly get a lighter sentence. So that would be the prisoner's dilemma. A problem with agreements is that any member of an agreement might cheat. In economics, they do look at it very, very seriously, because you may wonder, like in many, many economic relations, there's an element of trust. But can you trust somebody? Can you genuinely trust them? So that's why all sorts of institutions are created, such as courts and police and so on, to enforce that, to make sure people do not act selfishly. But do they sometimes act selfishly? Nonetheless, do they betray other people's trust? Like the example with the credit cards. You borrow money from a bank. Do you always pay it back? Does everybody pay it back? No, at some point somebody can say, you know what, I'm struggling financially, I'm just not going to pay you back. And then what do credit card companies do? Well, they can try to deal with you and offer you some kind of more favorable terms, right? If you negotiate with them, tell them, okay, I owe you $10,000, I don't have that much, but maybe I can give you 3. Are you going to be happy with that? And then they'll be like, no, but okay, we can do 5. Give us 5 now. Forget it, we will forgive you this debt. Now, do you think it's problematic? Do you think it's okay? Who's been selfish here?
The spender.
Yeah, like the bank, you can't say the bank was selfish. I mean, you're the one who borrowed the money. The bank didn't force you to borrow them. They gave you the conditions, you agreed to them, but then you decided that you're not going to pay back. There were days, by the way, in history when if something like this happens, they will actually throw you in jail. Nowadays, it's not happening. Nowadays, if it's just a credit and if you didn't commit fraud, then that will never happen. The worst thing is you can declare bankruptcy. They take if you have something valuable, but there are also limits on how much they can take. And the worst thing after that is you don't get any more credit, at least for a few years. So many people do that. They think, okay, well, that's not that bad. I'm struggling financially, so I'm going to do it anyway. But from the point of view of fairness, is that fair to do that? There's another interesting question. Where do banks get money? No, but to give the loan, they have to have money. So where do they get money? From us. When we put money in a bank, that's where the money coming from. So when somebody is not paying it back, that's actually our money. That's not banks' money. Banks don't print money. Do you have money in the bank right now? That's the money. If somebody borrows this very money, which bank has. And if they don't pay it back, they don't pay your money. And the bank actually is an intermediary. It tries to make sure that when your money being borrowed by somebody else, they do come back to you. Right? So that when somebody doesn't pay the bank, they actually are not paying back to all those people. And the banks, of course, do have certain tools to hedge that, right? That's why they may charge higher interest. So when they charge somebody 20% interest, effectively what they're doing is they're covering all those other key situations when they may not get their money back. So when they give 20% to one person and another person, and that other person is not paying back at all, or pays only portion of it back, this 20% really becomes like 5%. And then when you put money in a bank on a term CD loan, you get term CD, you get 5%. That's why you get 5% and not 20, because there's all these losses, there are operational expenses, they have to hire people to do all that. Okay, so the social contract. Now that will bring us to Thomas Hobbes. And in fact, it is something which, of course, like we talked about before, was known even before. Even Plato talks about something like this. Nonetheless, Thomas Hobbes is considered one of the most interesting philosophers who suggested in his book Leviathan this idea. So let's talk about Thomas Hobbes a little bit. Who was Thomas Hobbes? He was born in England in 1588, attended Oxford University. And Oxford University, most universities at the time were very scholastic. Scholasticism was just this very religious type of approach. Scholastics were studying Bible and Aristotle for the most part, and trying to kind of, to put it simply, square a Bible with Aristotle. That's what most universities were doing. Why? Because Aristotle's work became very, very well known in Europe in the 13th century, and it had quite an effect. And so Thomas Aquinas, who we'll talk about later in class, saw it as his project to reconcile the Bible with Aristotle, to make sure that Aristotle's ideas do not contradict the Bible, to prove that they don't contradict the Bible. That essentially Aristotle is like basically the first Christian, right? Even though he uses different terminology, but everything he says can be adapted very well. And this is mostly what they were studying. They were studying Aristotle, they were studying the Bible, and they were kind of working through this. This was university, traditional university education. But at this point, this is like early 17th century, around 1600, slightly over 1600, many people were getting tired with this. Science was already advancing. Younger people, as usual, are the first ones to pick up these new things, and to them this old-style scholastic education seemed like a waste of time. They thought that studying Aristotle in such a manner is not helpful, and of course they started to kind of go against it. A few other interesting happened at that time is English Civil War. English Civil War, that was a confrontation between the Parliament and the King. The King, in England for a very long time, the Parliament had a lot of power. It wasn't an absolute monarchy in a full sense of a word, because the King was somewhat restricted for many hundreds of years. Have you guys heard of Magna Carta? So what is Magna Carta? To the Parliament. Yeah, basically the nobles and the Parliament took some power away from the King. The King signed it, and he basically pledged that he will be King John at the time. I believe it was 12th century or something. Very, very long time ago. He signed it. And since then, English Parliament, the parliamentary system, the democracy was always pretty strong, and they still have a king. But of course, king had less and less and less power, and that was a huge confrontation. At that point in time, there was a confrontation between the parliament and the king. Without going into all the details, that got very nasty, and eventually king got beheaded. Thomas Hobbes was a witness of all that. In 1640, he actually escaped. He fled to France. That was shortly before the Civil War began. And still he saw what was happening. While he was in Paris, he served as a tutor to the Prince of Wales, who was in exile there, would later become King Charles II. And then he returned to Britain eventually after working out understanding with Oliver Cromwell, who was the leader of the parliamentary fraction. Now, some of the most important influences on Thomas Hobbes were, first of all, Galileo. Galileo's physics. Galileo was an amazing person. I don't know if you guys heard about him. He did a lot of experiments, and he was one among the first who actually took mathematics and introduced it to science. Prior to Galileo, science, Aristotelian science, did not use any mathematics. Aristotle actually didn't think mathematics is part of the natural sciences like physics. He didn't know how to apply that. And for this reason, people who studied Aristotle also didn't think about it in this way. There were also several other things which Aristotle kind of got a little bit weird. Like he thought there were 4 basic elements: earth, water, fire, and air. And this is what everything is made of. Now around this time also, the theory of Democritus, who is another ancient Greek, was resurrected, and that is atomism. But Aristotelian idea is not atomism. He thought there are these 4 basic elements. So when people started stepping away from Aristotle, it kind of helped science quite a bit, and Galileo was one of the first. So his physics really influenced Hobbes. Another thing is Euclidean geometry, this proof-based axiomatic system, which is also another thing Hobbes was trying to imitate. And finally, the Civil War. The Civil War was probably the most important. It began in full force in 1642. There was a long tension, like I said. Eventually, King James's son, Charles I, was fighting against the parliament. His army was defeated. He was captured and executed. They chopped off his head, and for a few years, there was no king in England. Oliver Cromwell took over the government. He was the protector of the Rome and ruled by himself, although he was kind of like delegate of the people. So in that sense, I may say they had a republic. Then eventually they decided to bring the monarchy back. That didn't work very well either. They had a problem with their king. So eventually they drove the king away, and William of Orange and his wife Mary, who was daughter of the king, came from Holland to take over. But the important point is the whole thing was a huge mess. Civil war is not fun, and Hobbes saw it with his own eyes. So it really impressed him. He saw what is happening when the order breaks down. So first of all, empiricism and science had a huge impact on his philosophy. Epistemological position of empiricism, the fact that we should trust our observations, first of all, before we speculate about things. And metaphysical materialism. Even though he wasn't a full-blown atheist, nonetheless, he was a materialist. He did not believe there is any spirit of any kind. He thought the entire world is made of matter, right? The way most materialists think. All materialists, I should say. So the whole world is matter in motion. And that did have an effect. So even though he was not an atheist, but he says, yeah, there may be some sort of ultimate cause, but he was not religious at all. He did not believe in the God of the Bible. The nature of God is of no interest to philosophy whatsoever or of science. He thought God, even if God exists, clearly does not interfere in human affairs, so we should just take care of ourselves. We should study nature, understand how the nature works. This is, remember, the deism, the idea that God just gave a first push, kind of, maybe he created the world, but then he does not interfere. He's not doing anything, there are no miracles, he's never changing the course of nature, everything just follows like a clockwork mechanism. The God wind up the clock is running now, and God is not touching it. So that's the idea here. And in the reading, if you read the Leviathan, he is actually saying this. He compares the human body to a machine. He says, for what is the heart but a spring, and the nerves but so many strings, and the joints but so many wheels, giving a motion to the whole body, such as intended by the artificer, the creator. So basically, we also like the clockwork mechanism. We are mechanisms. We are like robots. Everything in us is following the laws of nature, following these materialistic, mechanistic laws. So what does it mean then for morality, for our psychology? Well, psychology also is fully mechanistic. It is works just like any other mechanism. Right? Everything has causes. Mental events are identical to motions within the body. Just like within the clock, there's like some of this mechanical things moving, and that produces an effect. Same thing within us. Images, phantasms or fancies, not present in objects themselves. Instead, they are just appearances. And then what distinguishes humans is just language. We are, of course, animals just like any other animal. But since we have language, language does, of course, have an effect on us. And that is what distinguishes us. Words are marks that stand for certain sensations, such as that the relations between words corresponds to the relations between events. And reasoning is just kind of calculation. It is nothing but reckoning. That is, adding and subtracting of the consequences of general names agreed upon by the making and signifying of our thoughts. So when we reason, we just do this mental mathematics. Now, they mentioned that he was a nominalist. This is another interesting thing from the medieval even debate about universals. Medievals were very puzzled by the universals. So what is a universal? It is something that can be common to many particular things. Remember we talked about Plato, there was this picture of dogs. So what is common amongst all the dogs? Why do we call them all dogs, even though they're all so different? So medievals were puzzled by this, and there were several reasons why it seemed very important. The relationship of universals to the reality. Problem was provoked by Boethius, who lived in, I believe, 6th century. His translation of Porphyry's introduction to Aristotle's categories. So there's actually three possibilities which Porphyry discusses about universals, whether they exist in reality independently or exist in understanding alone. That's one question, right? Remember, Plato actually believed that they are independent reality, the forms which are somewhere outside the cave, in his example. So there's a form of justice, there's a form of dogness, there's a form of triangle. But the other position, obviously, is that no, it's just in our understanding and they are not real. There's no parallel reality with ideal triangle. That's just a bunch of real triangles and we are comparing them. If they do exist in reality, of course, then there is a question whether they're material or immaterial, and whether they're separate from objects or not separate from objects. Plato believed they are separate from objects, but are they? And three positions emerged based on this question: realism, nominalism, and conceptualism. So let us start with realism. Extreme realism would be Plato. Plato just said universals are real, which is why it's called realism. It's actually not realism in the same sense as we think when we say he's a realist. It's a realism in regard to universals. Saying universals are real entities just means that they do exist in some parallel reality, that there is in fact a universal of dogness. And every time we look at the dog, we compare a dog to this parallel reality to which our soul has some sort of access, right? So that would be saying that universal exists in reality and they are immaterial. So they are not part of this world at all. Now, why did it seem reasonable to them? It seems such a crazy idea. First of all, there are epistemological reasons. If universals do not name real things, we are reasoning about fictions. What are we talking about when we say dog? We're not talking about a particular dog. There has to be something connecting all these dogs. What are we talking about when we say human? Why are we all human? What does it mean? If it's not some sort of real relation, then what is it? And there are also theological reasons why they were concerned about it. So the doctrine of original sin. I think we mentioned it before, right? The doctrine of what is the doctrine of original sin? That Adam and Eve sinned, and for this reason we all carry the burden. We're all guilty of that. Well, if there's no such thing as the human nature, then how can you say we are responsible for the sins of these other people? So from a religious point of view, human nature is necessary to explain that. And also the Holy Trinity, that's another problem. How many gods are there in Christianity? Well, it's supposed to be one. Is there? Who is Jesus Christ?
It's supposed to be the Son of God.
Okay, but is he God himself? So what's his relation with the Son of God? Like literally God had a wife and they
Some people say he's God given human form.
Okay, so in other words, it's the same God as the, or is it a different God? And there's also Holy Spirit, by the way. And who's this Holy Spirit? Doesn't it seem like there are three gods actually? Or is it one God? That was a huge problem for the early Christians. And they actually tried to solve it using a Greek concept of essence. They said that they all share in divine essence. They are three different entities, but the essence is the same. But then you have to believe that there is such thing as separate essence. So that's why the concept of a universal, again, was necessary to explain that. Otherwise, you may have a problem. Even if you say Jesus Christ himself is God, well, so God died on a cross? They killed God? It seems problematic, right? So these are the problems with realism. Of course, another problem is if we all participate in the universal of humanity participates in the universal of mammal, right? We're all mammals, which is part of the universal of animal, and so on. And all of this is a participation in being, but being is identical to God. So are we all then part of God? Now that's pantheism. That actually is a fallacy. God's supposed to be a separate entity. So all of this caused some scholars, even as early as 11th century, to basically disagree with that and say no, that position is known as nominalism, and they were disagreeing with the fact that universals are real entities. They were saying they're only names. Nomina means name, so that's why they called it nominalism. And like I said, Hobbes was nominalist. So from nominalist point of view, when we say dog, there's no dogness of any kind. We just look at individual dogs and kind of find something in common among them, but it's just a word. There's nothing behind it whatsoever. Rosalind was one of the first. Church at the time considered it to be a heresy. Some of them were even burned at the stake, but nonetheless it kind of persevered. Nominalism also has a number of problems. First of all, undermines the original sin. So from religious point of view, universalism necessary to explain the original sin. If you believe that there's no common human essence whatsoever, then of course original sin doesn't work. And same thing with the question of the divine trinity, undermines that too, which is why church was so opposed to that. But even some people who believed in God still thought it makes more sense. Eventually it will prevail, and the conceptualism is kind of an intermediary position, right? It's type of a compromise. It's complicated, but the idea was introduced by Peter Abelard, who was one of the important logicians, interesting guy, lived in the 11th century too. And Abelard explained that universal word in itself is just a sound, just like nominal is saying. But it gets its power from the fact that it points to a universal concept, which is why it's called conceptualism. And the concept is the word's logical content, significance, or meaning, which actually is real. Some form of it will later also be found in Hegel and a number of more modern philosophers. So unlike nominalism, conceptualism does not dismiss completely the reality of the universals. It just, unlike Plato, doesn't think that they are like this entity somewhere out there sitting which we can compare things with. Now, back to Hobbes, he did think that everything is determined, right? We only have a few minutes, so let me just kind of wrap it up. As a result of that, all those influences, he thought that human beings are just like robots, and they really don't have any freedom of the will. But whatever strongest emotion they have will prevail. And we frequently don't know ourselves what will prevail, which emotion, because it's like this yo-yo model, right? We don't know which side it will fall if you spin it, but we know that it will fall on some kind of side. Can I finish today? So ethical emotions. The object of desire is something we call good. The object of aversion we call evil. And they kind of pull us like the machine, right? And the strongest one will win. So this is this full-blown materialism. Good and evil are inescapably subjective and so on. But what do you then do? Well, Leviathan is an attempt to kind of argue that the state is necessary to prevent evil. To secure peace, according to Hobbes, people must confer all their power and strength upon one man or upon assembly of men. So he wasn't actually for a king. He didn't care whether it's a parliament, a king. But there has to be a group of people or a person who has all the power. And it is for our own good, because that's the only way society will function. If you don't have that, then you will have chaos. Where there is no stable government, there is chaos. Chaos is to be avoided at all costs, because it's the worst thing ever. So no government is the worst situation. Any government is better than no government. So for this reason, he thought we literally should just give up all our rights to the government, because the government will keep us from ourselves. Without government, we will just kill each other. People are selfish, robot-like animals. They always pursue their own pleasure. They need this kind of organization. If there is no government, every man has a right to everything, and even to one another's body. Constant state of fear. There's a good quote. I do want to read it. So, in such a condition, if there is no government, there is no place for industry, because fruit thereof is uncertain. Consequently, no culture on earth, no navigation, no use of commodities that may be imported by the sea, no commodities building, no instruments of moving or removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, which is worst of all, continual fear, danger of violent death, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Okay, I guess we will finish on this. We'll come back to that a little bit next time and talk about Nietzsche.